We have a long day ahead of us, and a tough one as well. There are still a few house rules that I want to remind you before we get started, of which is the most important one, the one that tells you how to behave here in this audience. And the behavior that I, as a moderator, expect from you is very informal. So as a proof of that, I'm going to take my jacket off. And you're welcome to do the same. It is going to be hot today. But more seriously, the idea is that we have organized the day in sessions. What I do propose is that we will have the session speakers deliver their speeches, and we'll have questions and answers after every session. If there is a clarifying question during the talk that the presenters are going to give, then please raise your hand. I will interrupt and ask you to place that question ahead of us, because the chances are that somebody else needs clarification then as well. But other than that, questions and answers later on. But one important reminder, even though I know many of you and the speakers do as well, please do introduce yourselves. That helps us all also understand your background and understand who is speaking, for further reference as well for the people to keep record. Everybody agrees? I'll try to keep time. We try to be sharp because we have many speakers and they all have a lot to say. And I try to not speak that much anymore myself, as I already done. So without having said that, what I would like to do is I would like to introduce our first speaker today. We, as organizers, we had an idea of having Niels Torvalds, a member of the EU Parliament and the shadow rapporteur of LULUCF, to speak before us. But then we changed our mind collectively and decided that we would have instead Katarina Dahlman, who actually knows more about this subject than Niels, because she's an advisor to Niels. And the chances are that we'll be learning more from her than from Niels. So this was the idea, have a very technical, hands-on event today, and this is why Katarina is here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What an introduction. I will make sure Niels hears about this. Thank you very much. My name is Katarina Dahlman, and I'm the parliamentary assistant or advisor to Niels Torvalds, who unfortunately could not be here today. I'll speak on behalf of him, but in my person, which sometimes is the same thing. We tend to become more like one person the more we work together. The LULUCF regulation is, of course, one of the key pieces of EU climate legislation. And the importance of the LULUCF sector will likely only increase as we move towards 2030 and the second half of this century. We are now entering discussions in the institutions about single-use plastics. We are also looking forward to negotiations on a 2050 strategy and discussions about the bioeconomy. And here we believe that the bio-based sectors will and can provide solutions for the future. For us working on the LULUCF regulation from the side of the Parliament, the Paris Agreement was always, in a way, a guiding principle, but also the driver for ambition and our intentions. The Paris Agreement underlines that the inclusion of the LULUCF sector in climate change mitigation efforts is essential if we are to meet our long-term goals of limiting global temperature rise. With this backdrop in mind, then, the key objective for us was to try to live up to the expectations of determining how the sector could be included in the EU climate policy framework, as well as to adopt a robust accounting system for emissions and removals in the sector. Having said this, what was meant to be the introduction of clear reporting and accounting rules, which seems like quite a technical exercise, one could think, turned out into one of the bigger political and ideological negotiations about forestry the LULUCF sector and its carbon pool and sink potential at large. I don't think we'll, for example, be discussing the meaning of the word intensity quite as intensely as during these negotiations for a while. It's often easy to be wise, or try to be wiser, in hindsight. And in hindsight, perhaps from our point of view, the political debate about the role of our forests and forest management practices was not a bad thing, because it's, of course, important to negotiate and discuss these key issues. However, we feel that the focus from the side of the Parliament, at least, often was too narrow for the magnitude of this topic. The focus in our internal debates easily and often turn into questions of how much of the forest we should protect or conserve, rather than a question about what we should use our forests for. And this, I say for me, for Mr. Torvalds, would have been the more interesting question. Our forests are extraordinary and provide us with environmental, social, and economic benefits. Our forests are also different in nature and have different vulnerabilities. We heard the situation in Tuscany, for example, at the moment. But one thing is, or should be, common, and this is maybe the key message from this intervention: sustainable forest management. Sustainable forest management is key in enabling the sector to live up to its full potential on all fronts, both when it comes to climate change mitigation, but also in the transition to a circular economy. Our forests are crucial elements in our efforts to limit global warming, but also in paving the way for a more sustainable future. This is why, although the devil is in the details, and as you know, the details in the LULUCF regulation are many, I would like to take this opportunity to remind us about the importance of remembering the big picture. Mr. Torvalds always encourages us to be curious and strong enough to look forward to the future. This means that any use of our forests should be based on adopted sustainable forest management practices and policies, but we should not bind the future of the forest to its past. By looking towards the future and creating sustainable frameworks for legislation, we believe that we can optimize the use of our forests so that all pillars, climate and biodiversity, social and economic, are attended to and allowed to live up to their fullest potential. Thank you.
Thank you. Everything clear? I know there will be questions, some doubts perhaps as well, and but we'll have, if no clarifying questions, then as we agreed, we will continue with presentations, and the next presentation will be given by Viorel Rudea from the Transylvanian University of Brașov, Romania, and he will be speaking about the role of European forests in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And Viorel, you will have exactly 10 minutes for that presentation.
Thank you very much. So then I have to be very fast. I'm Viorel Rudea. I'm a research coordinator at Transylvania University in Brașov, Romania, and now we implement in a group of members from 6 countries this forest limit project, on which I come back sometimes later. Now I like to, whenever I have to deal with stakeholders and decision makers, especially going east in European Union and then further east outside European Union, I see they are skeptical on climate change and they say we can't do anything. So I always first highlight 2 things. First thing to do, I tell them that we have considerable scientific evidence that proves we have to deal with the accelerated climate change, and then I try to motivate their action based on at least two of the principles related to environmental, which are embedded in environmental law related to sustainable development of our society in the future. So one is precautionary principle, which says that even the science didn't prove that we'll have a very clear threat in the future. We still, but we have some signs of the threat, and then we have to deal with that kind of things in a way which is, let's say, cost effective for our preparation. So with that, I would go further away here, and so now coming to climate change issue and forest sector, I see two different now being back after many years, let's say, in policy making, supporting policymaker. Now I'm back in contact more with foresters, and I see there are two different kind of approaches. So we have the concern, let's say of practitioners, which is, I call it bottom-up concern, because they face the actual change of patterns of climate in their daily activities. While we have a top-down framework which is more related to mitigation. So while the ground grassroots, let's say, practitioners are more interested in adaptation and resilience of forest and even the business, there is an additional pressure coming, let's say, from top down, which is related to mitigation. So the thing is that how we put this together in a way that practitioners can deal with that and do actually things in the field. When you look to adaptation and resilience, I just collected facts that show that in Europe there are issues related to adaptation, and practitioners already deal with this kind of things. So, and this slide here, this information is actually based on information which I got working in Focus Group 24, tools and instruments for mitigation and adaptation in forestry, which is implemented by within this European Innovation Partnership managed by DG Agri. So people noticed, practitioners noticed stand stability and forest management problems, especially issues generated by climate change and nature effects like storms, drought, fire, and so on. Then there are also changes in growth and productivity, and there are also not only bad news related to climate change, but there are also good news, because some regions, some locations in Europe experience better conditions for growth for forests. So from this point of view, there are also both possible reactions. Then, of course, forestry operation and businesses are also very much affected. Reduced accessibility, like reduced accessibility on non-frozen soils especially in Nordic countries. Higher cost for road maintenance because storms. Cost of control of invasive species, which might be let's say, in a favorable condition generated by change of climate change locally. Shift to broadleaf species, which might have impact on the industry at local level. So then there are adaptation measures which might be implemented, and first, let's say, first they have to quantify the changes. If there are changes, they are real changes, or and then the system in place should be able to detect these changes. Of course, then there should be proactive adaptation strategies rather than reactive strategies. And then, of course, when it's about climate change, because of local circumstances, we cannot work with only one, with standard type of approaches. So these have to be very much designed, let's say, and improved locally. Then when we go to the other approach, to top-down, let's say, where we have to do with the greenhouse gas mitigation, we know that in the EU, forest is a sink of about 420 million tons of CO2, and then I just put a line here showing that there is slightly an increasing trend. Then harvested wood products sink counts also, the brown bars here also count like 40 million tons of CO2 per year. What we see that also that about 20% of roundwood is used as firewood, so that's the fifth of the harvested roundwood in the forest. So we see that actually there is a quite strong pressure on forest, and this pressure is expected to increase in the future with increasing demand for bioeconomy caused by substitution of other materials with wood. And one such example how forests react to this pressure from economy, we can see here in this example, where in this graph, where over the crisis years 2007 to 2009, we see the sink increased. In 2007 was very low, while harvested wood products increased, the carbon stock in harvested wood products increased. While going through the crisis, the sink increased while the carbon stock in harvested wood products decreased, and that was related to the dynamic of the harvest. Harvest decreased because of low demand, and then the carbon stock in harvested wood products pool decreased. So this is how forest sink react quickly, let's say, to economic pressures. So now, of course, when we work with the sink and all these greenhouse gases, we have in the end the final purpose is to understand what's happening actually with regard to relation between land and atmosphere. So here we have a study published, which I think it's interesting for us to understand a bit how this relation between land and atmosphere works. So this study actually refers to net primary production, which means how much physical biomass is actually fixed in 1 year on some land. When we look to entire Europe, we see that some countries have very high net primary production, which are most productive, while going north and going south, this productivity decreases. But the thing is, then in the end, how this MPP is actually used by the countries. So this MPP, in fact, is split on 4 components. It's harvest, it's then emission disturbances, then decomposition of organic matter, and then net biomass production, which is in fact left on the land when all those losses actually go. So in order to see a bit comparison between the countries, we only look to this internal circle, which are spread here all over the countries. And so one thing is that in blue we have this harvest. So harvest, of course, differ from country to country, but we can see that some countries have very low share of harvest and high share of blue, which is in fact the decomposition. So the question from management point of view of this greenhouse gas axis practically goes in the direction to ask, can we modify the share? Can we reduce the share of losses through decomposition? And especially this is important because that decomposition actually refers also to decomposition of deadwood, which is practically not harvested but left in the forest. And we see a high share of such loss from decomposition, and most likely a high contribution from deadwood in these countries here. Then we also see that of course countries have different management of the total net sector entire sector management exchange to the atmosphere. For example, we have a good here in between UK. UK has very low share of harvested wood products, which means most of this carbon absorbed from atmosphere is stored on the land, while in Ireland we see a lower amount of carbon, which is stored on land, and higher amount which goes in harvested wood products. So this is how we can manage and administrate the amount of CO2 which is removed and store it in wood components. Again, here, when you look to state of European forest, I just on the green bars represent the average carbon stock in for at the country level for all these countries here, while the blue lines are the growth. So when we talk to mitigation measures, we have kind of like two options, like extreme options. One is to increase the carbon stock in stand, and the other one is to increase the increment in order to supply more for wood chain use. So here behind this, maybe there are, of course, this average number on the country, there are a lot of things. But when we try to understand why countries in the same region, like neighbor countries, have different values for these indicators. So, for example, here these countries have almost the same equal standing volume, while the increment is very much different. Another example here. We also notice here, we also notice here that some East European countries are more conservative, so they have very lower growth compared to other countries when it's about the same standing stock. So what we promote now is this climate smart forestry, which means you know, we do mitigation, but in a way that the forest sector is sustainable as such. Now, based on the experience from the countries, and there is more and more information on how this climate smart forestry can be implemented in practice. One thing to say, you know, that we have this national system established at national scale where the country is supposed to monitor, measure, and estimate, and also report greenhouse gas exchanges associated to not only to forest but to all land uses. So whatever you do in the field, it's captured by this national system and then reported by the country toward the commitment. Okay, now just one thing related to LULUCF regulation implementation. First is to understand that the accounting rules are defined, so they cannot be changed anymore until at least 2030. So the question is now for you, when you work at national level to implement this regulation, you have to identify where are the incentives in these accounting rules, because these accounting rules have incentives implicitly embedded in the way how they are formulated. So in Fort Limit project which we run, we work on accounting rules at global level to understand what is the impact of various accounting rules, and then also design policies and measures which are supposed to be implemented at national level. Then accounting rules will be implemented at national scale. So the question is how you as small entities, subnational entities, supposed to be involved, or how can you involve? And here our project works on a benchmarking approach, we call it, for in order to define how small area estimates can be involved in this mitigation process. Then the land sector target is flexibility are for entire sector, for entire LULUCF. So then the question is, you have to find your place as a forest sector within the land use sector in land use sector within the country. And then, of course, looking forward, it's the thing for foresters in any case, because, and then there is additional target in Paris Agreement where we have to have in mind that we need neutral economies at the mid of the century. So concluding remarks here, when we manage forest and when we report greenhouse gas mitigation, we don't work only with living biomass, but we also work with all carbon pools and fluxes. So that's important to understand. And then, as I said, it's up to you at national level to define ways how to include, to involve subnational entities in this mitigation effort, which we're supposed to do. And then, of course, we can't look only to mitigation, we have to look also quite much to adaptation, of course, having in mind all other services that forests have to provide to society. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Guru. I was cheating on you. I gave you 10 minutes. You took 15, but I knew that you would. But please have a seat here, and we will continue with the talks. And as I promised before, there will be time for questions and answers. And those of you who have extended questions and want to discuss more, as a reminder, we'll have a joint lunch together. There is an opportunity to discuss at lunch as well as at the end of the day, we'll have a 40-minute session for to whatever questions there were not raised or not answered yet to be discussed and debated. And Viorel is a source of information. Obviously, we'll have an opportunity to ask more questions from him as well. But the next speaker will be Jörg Schweinle from Thünen Institute, and he will give us a talk on how carbon balance of wood in Germany would be affected by different forest management options. So we'll go more into detail in how forest management exactly should be carried out for the purpose.
Thank you. There's one question.
No, we have just a request. Mr. Callas, could you please get on the side during your presentations?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to show you today is a scientific exercise, more or less. So I'm not a politician. I'm not going to present you a German forest baseline or of any kind, but an exercise on what you should have in mind if you look into forestry and the long-term effects in forests. So we came from a couple of years ago, you all might remember the carbon debt debate we had, and there were many papers out there presenting different modeling approaches on how to tackle the problem, and we thought that could be done better than many of the papers had been doing that. So our questions were, how do carbon pools in forests and wood products develop over time in Germany? That was our starting point. What are the main drivers for the development of German forest and wood seed pools? And how important is the famous substitution effect on that? So how did we do that? It's based on our National Forest Inventory data. And we have a model in place that is primarily an economic model doing economic analysis of forest enterprises. But however, in order to do that, you have to have the forest development behind that model. Otherwise, you couldn't do any economic analysis. So that's the main information. We do that for 200 years. Why we do that? Because forestry is a very slow reacting beast, you could call it. So everything is really long term. And 200 years, for example, is the average rotation period for oak in Germany. So at least for oak trees, we would like to have one rotation period covered. And then we did some scenario analysis. So I have to annoy you with some technical figures. But why? Because if you do that, you have to take into account many, many things in order to get the model running and not to overlook or to just forget some things in your modeling approach. As I said, it's based on our National Forest Inventory. We had a small one in 2008, so it's not the latest one, but we started with that exercise a bit earlier. Then we have, in order to simulate how forests react, we have yield tables in place that giving the information on how forests grow. Of course, they have been adapted to the actual growing situation in Germany because the current yield tables we have, they are a bit outdated. They are not really covering how forest grows. Then we have to look on the harvesting volumes that are produced in the forests. And of course, we have to look into the complete biomass, not only roundwood, but also coarse wood needles and biomass itself. So these are just for the foresters among us to get an idea on what is the modeling based on. You can see here the different tree species groups, spruce, beech, pine, oak, and Douglas fir. Why Douglas fir? I will come later to that. Then we have the yield classes representing how forests grow. And you can see it's 0.2, which is in the actual yield table it's not existing because it stops at 1. So you can see that in order, so looking back when the yield tables have been developed, forests grow much better today than they did in those years where those yield tables have been developed. Now we have rotation length, we have different conversion factors from wood to carbon, and we have, of course, decay times for the different diameters for deadwood. Then, of course, the roundwood that is produced by the forests will end up in forest industries. And for our modeling, these ratios between the different uses, so industrial groundwood, fuel wood, and harvesting residues, is kept constant. This is for modeling purposes, and of course we do modeling for 200 years, and of course we could have tried to model forest products markets for 200 years period, but everyone would have said, do you think this is a realistic approach? So just for the for having some information on that, we just kept it constant over time. What are the carbon pools we are looking at? So first of all, it's tree biomass, it's the deadwood, it's the soil carbon, and we had a thorough look into how soil carbon does react in German forests, and there is a real mixed picture. Some say it's changing over time during the last decades, some say it's not. So it's quite controversial in literature, but we have a soil inventory, and colleagues from another institute, they stated that there is no change in soil carbon, so it's kept constant over time as well. Then we look at forest products, fuel wood, and waste wood. So just to cover the whole lot. Now, then of course the roundwood is ending up in forest products. And these are the shares as they have been in 2009 for Germany. So 44% is ending up in sawwood, 33% in wood-based panels, 10% in paper, 8% is fiber losses on the way. And then of course you have, if you produce, for example, sawnwood or other products, you have offcuts, and they are going either into, for example, from sawmilling industry in woodworking industries, or energetic use, and of course there is shares as well. So 69% from sawnwood is going to other products, and 31% from wood-based panels, and they're also set to zero, so constant over the 200 years modeling period. And then, of course, we have trade. Heavily trade, and we did look also back in time in Germany, and what we could see is that 1 year Germany is a net importer, and 1 year it's a net exporter. But the margins are rather small. So it's not big amplitude in the trade figures, so net trade is set to zero as well. So what you can see is supply, mainly a supply-driven model. It's not a market-driven model, because 200 years of modeling period with a forest products model, for example, one could do that, but the uncertainty to do that is really high. Now, substitution. We have one average substitution factor for the forest products. That is based on a study done for Germany, and it's coming up with 1.5 ton of carbon for the forest products. And the other one is based on a study that has done in Switzerland, and Sartre and O'Connor, and it's 0.67 ton carbon per ton carbon for the forest bioenergy. Now, and in order to show what if you change forest management practices, we created 5 different scenarios covering different approaches to forests. First one is the business as usual, and that is based on mainly the forest management practices of the federal states in Germany, because the federal states are the biggest forest owners. And they are representing forest management in Germany. And as I said, it does not reflect by any means an official German forest reference level. It's just for this exercise. Then we thought, okay, there might be an option to use more fuel wood, so we increased that from 30 to 40% of the felling volume to the expense of industrial roundwood. Then we had, of course, that's the climate adaptation part. If we think that some forest species are under stress in future due to high temperatures, we would replace them by high-yield tree species, or that tree species that are more adapted to a warmer climate, and that would be Douglas fir in our example. Then, of course, we have to have in mind the renewable energy markets in Germany, which are quite dominant or prominent. And we thought, okay, over time we will have an increasing supply of renewable energies, and that would lower the substitution factor for energy use of wood. It's just to show how the different figure to show what the impact is. Then, of course, one could use more forest residues, so that is non-coarse wood. If you would do that, increasing by 50%, and then number 5, this is the economics, the most economic way to manage forests, and this is harvesting done by maximum annual increment. This is from a forest economics perspective the most economic one. However, it would change how forests are managed in Germany completely and very significantly. Now, and again, what I'm going to show now is no relative values but absolute values. Starting from our modeling in 2013, we are starting with the current stock in the forests, in the soils, and in the forest products. And what you can see here is how, over time, the carbon stocks would change. The green line is how carbon stocks would change in the forests. The red line is in the harvested wood products, and the black line is the sum, the total. And you can see a negative value is an increase, and a positive value would be an emission. And what you can see here is based on national forest inventories. In our business as usual, we would have an increase of the stocks in the forest until 2063. And from then on, it's going to be lower, so we would have more carbon emissions from the forests. And then again, it would be after some 150 years, we would get an increase. Why is that? This is primarily based on the age class distribution in German forests. And they are given. You can't do anything about it. So you have very, very productive spruce, for example, that have been planted after the war, and they are now in their peak. And of course, if they are going to be harvested in 2063, we will have sea emissions from our forests. Now, what would happen if you would use the timber utilization a bit? So 10% more forest for forest energy. Changes are not very significant. What would happen if you would substitute our current tree species with climate adapted, for example, Douglas fir? There, the differences are bigger because Douglas is very productive. Douglas fir, we would have a higher increase in carbon during their growth phase. But then again, if we start to harvest them, of course, the sea emissions would go up. in total, there's not a big difference because, of course, the wood from Douglas fir would end up in forest markets, and what we would see is an increase in the harvested wood products. So we would have a shift from carbon in forests to carbon into forest products. More residues use, again, not a big change. However, if we would do the extreme, so would change our forest management system into a very intense one, harvesting at maximum annual increment, the picture changes completely. So the losses we would have in the phase when we would start to change our management practices, and that would be in 40 years, the system would be changed, we would have huge losses in forest carbon pools. And they are, over time, they are not recovering. And the same is, of course, we would have an increased carbon in the harvested wood products because more wood is produced in the forests, and of course more wood would be shifted into the harvested wood products. But altogether, the picture would be unfavorable compared to the other options. Here is the sum. You can see all the different scenarios put together. So the first four are very slightly together. There's not a big change as a whole, as a sum, but scenario 5 would change the picture completely. But now, if you would take into account substitution, as we did, the picture changes completely. First of all, the magnitude changes. So this is the substitution effect, again, summed up for 200 years. And you can see, looking at the forest, we were at 160 teragrams of carbon. Now we are ending up after 200 years with some 6,000 teragrams. And the picture in the scenarios changes as well completely, because all of a sudden, for example, scenario 5 would be not the least favorable option, because due to the high substitution effect that would occur by having more forests, more wood produced and ending up in forest products, scenario 5 would be not that bad when it comes to substitution. The most favorable one would be the green one, that's scenario 2, that would be if we would replace our current tree species with climate adapted, for example, Douglas fir. So, summing up, forest structure and management predominantly determine the development of all sequels. What you do in the forests have huge impacts on the markets. Of course, one could say, well, yes, we could change our management behavior, we could stop using our forests, but of course, our industries would use wood from somewhere else. Maybe not as favorable as from German forests and our sustainability rules. If you do modeling, the starting point or the length of accumulation period affects results significantly. So if you would only look on 30 years, for example, and would base your decisions on a 30-year modeling period, you would lose, or you would, in my opinion, there's a high chance that you do misjudgments if you don't look at a longer time period. Because you just cut off after 30 years, which is, of course, from a political point of view, a reasonable time frame, but from a forest and a forester's point of view, it's not. This base of results relative to a reference, again, could give you crazy results. Depending on which reference you choose, you would end up that, for example, the use of wood would be less favorable than using of fossil fuels. If you choose your system like that, you could end up with such a result. So, the impact of forest products markets might be underestimated in our model, but again, I said the problem if you do that for 200 years with a GFBM, for example, global forest products model, you would end up with, frankly speaking, rubbish. because it's really uncertain, and compared to forest development, it's more uncertain, because trees, we know a bit on how trees grow. Yeah, and the final one, the long-term development of forests should guide climate policies. Don't look at 30 or 40 years, look at 200. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we've heard 3 extremely interesting talks. I'm bubbling with questions, I have to say, but we will only take 3.
Not a question.
Not a question.
Why don't you use the microphone?
Why don't I use the microphone? I didn't know I need to.
Nobody uses it.
Okay, can we be heard to the back rows, or was that it? Okay,
Yeah.
microphone would be better. I do apologize for that, take a note. Any questions to any of the 3 speakers? I would have many, but you all will stay, right?
Yep.
Katrina, you as well.
Yeah.
I will leave after this.
You will leave after that. Then I will have a question for you, if you do not mind. I was trying to listen to you, and the way you presented the bird's eye view or the parliamentary view to this was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I got a feeling that well, you mentioned it. You had an ideological and political battle over the forestry matters when you got into it, and then you reached a conclusion that went along the lines of we should not bind the future to the past, right? Yet that LULUCF regulation, that's exactly what it does. So did you? Well, are you happy with the results? Should I ask? Can I ask this way? Or is Nils happy with the results?
Should I use the microphone? Or
Yes, please do.
maybe
Yeah. I think it's yeah.
yeah, I'll get up as well. Okay, that's a frank question. Thank you. Well, this was exactly one of the key negotiations, at least within the parliament and the negotiation team there. In a way, what strategy and how we should look at the issue. As we heard, the cycles of the forest growth cycles vary and are long. So there, the debate was concentrated in a way on the issue of the forest reference levels and the setting of them, and whether indeed they should be a period in the past or a period not in the future, but in a way a period or years that could be updated as we move along and see how the forest evolves. Regarding your very straight question about whether Mr. Zorvas is happy with the outcome, I will say it's a compromise.
Fair
It is a compromise, of course, made at the political level, but this indeed for the implementation, it will be interesting to see what the discussions today show also, because we indeed have a forest reference level set now. It's a period of time from 2000 to 2009. I hope I got it correctly. And then you, in a way, you evaluate the emissions and removals referring back to that period. Whether it's long enough remains to be seen. It's now, of course, decided upon. But indeed, this and political and ideological debates are, of course, why the members of the European Parliament are there. I mean, it's to debate these important issues. But from our point of view, the debate was quite quickly locked in into a question of whether we should conserve the forest or not, rather than indeed speaking more about the cycles and the variations in different member states. That's the broader picture.
Okay. Well, thank you for an honest answer to an honest question. One more question then.
Good morning.
morning. My name is Ulrich Leberle from CEPI, European Paper Industry. I would have a question to you, Mr. Schweinle. Thanks a lot. It was very interesting as a presentation. You mentioned that in your modeling you have looked at the forests and the long-term development of the forests, and not so much at markets, because forests are relatively better predictable than markets. How did you, and we're of course very interested in the substitution effects. We see paper, of course, as a material that will substitute other materials, fossil-intensive materials. But how did you do then in the end, towards the end of your presentation, you took in the substitution effect, and how did you model there? You must have modeled what kind of materials are to be substituted to come to those results. Maybe you could tell a bit of that, please. Thank you.
To be honest, that's the sloppy bit of our modeling. So what we did, we just for material use, we have that fixed substitution factor of 1.5, and for the energetic use we have the fixed 0.67. So we don't distinguish between the different forest products in our modeling. Of course, you could do that. That would be more accurate. Yes. But in that paper, our idea was to show the magnitude of substitution effect, and whether you would do that in more detail, so having a substitution factor for each different forest product, and even have it changing over time, because the substitution effects are changing over time. It would be more accurate. However, the magnitude would be the same. Not maybe as high as we had if you do it in more detail, but it would be the same. So the substitution effect is, I wouldn't say always, but most likely always bigger than what is happening in the forests.
Thank you, Jörg. One more question from the audience? Yes, please. Piotr, could you pass the... Oh. Come back. Over there.
Good morning to all. I'm Luís Corsalhão. I'm from Portugal. I'm director of a paper company and research and planning. It's both a question and a comment for the three of you, because when you start talking about the big discussion about the accounting rules, we can notice after your presentation on German the impact of this, the different scenarios looking upon German forests, and you look upon your figures on the situation of different countries in Europe. You really understand that, in fact, all countries have very different situations: overstocked, understocked, close to maximum growth, age structure very different, and so on. So, in reality, the situation in each country is so different from each other that the scenarios, if you apply to Germany or if you do the same job in everywhere, you get completely different results. Which means at the end of the day that the measures that collectively we do, the more detail we go, the more strange will be, the more difficult will be, and the more meaningful will be. So the question here is a little bit, how can we, let's say, overcome these difficulties and try to have a general setup scene for Europe, for the future, that doesn't jeopardize the full European forest sector and maximizes just one particular area or other particular area. How can we come up to this? How do you see that we can put these regional European scene together with what you just mentioned, this local scene, more at a local scale, where just really the impacts from those that do manage the forest and have the forest assets can take the best from the area. So it's a little bit, how can we cope these different perspectives, these global, these local, and particularly taking into account that for each country the scenarios will be so different from each other that the more detailed the rules are, the more impossible it will be to turn out to be a good maximum example for you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question, and I do know that all the speakers have answers to that as well. But as the organizers have put together the agenda for today, I have a feeling that the next speaker and speakers actually will be addressing this specific question in detail, and which is why, in the interest of the timetable today, I propose that that the question will be answered, no doubt about that. But we'll let these three people off the hook at the moment with the round of applause that we owe to them. I did not mean to be rude. This was not the idea. Just the fact that we will have to go on with our agenda. There will be three people standing up in a second, and there will be three people standing up from the audience in a second to come up here. So they'll be replacing the chairs. In the interest of treating everybody here, please everybody stand up for a sec. And those who won't be coming up here, make a round around your left shoulder. Please do. I assure you it's good for you. So, but Giacomo, Anu, and Simon, please come up.
Hello. You are from
I think we have talked.
yeah.